Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. Special good afternoon to my colleagues in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honourable Senator Dr. Amery Browne, leader of the opposition business in the Senate, as well as Member of Parliament for the constituency of Diego Martin West, the Honourable Hans de Vignes. Let me first start by indicating to members of the population that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is currently engaged in some discussions at the United Nations General Assembly, and Dr. Browne, in his contribution, in not too long from now, will give some further information on her presence at the United Nations General Assembly being held at this point in time. So welcome to the opposition's weekly press conference, and today we hope to address some key matters of national importance and to expose ourselves to examination by members of the media, hopefully that we can provide information for the education of members of the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago. I want to start by recognizing the 114th anniversary of the birth of our founding father, Dr. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, and the founder of the People's National Movement. I want to recognize his contribution to national development in Trinidad and Tobago, for the work that he has done in establishing the first political party in Trinidad and Tobago, and for what he has done in the entire region. Today gives us a perfect opportunity to thank the Honourable Dr. Eric Eustace Williams for his major contribution to national development in Trinidad and Tobago and the region. And despite recent attempts by some of our colleagues opposite to rewrite history, to rewrite the historical record on the work of Dr. Eric Williams, we want to make it abundantly clear that despite our political differences, because political differences we will always have that, but we cannot entertain persons who, because of their narrow, self-seeking political agenda, try and make despicable attempts to rewrite the history of Dr. Eric Williams in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. As the opposition chief whip, as the chairman of the People's National Movement that was founded by Dr. Eric Williams, I am a product of his policies and programs for national development in Trinidad and Tobago. And I am certain that Dr. Amery Browne and MP Hans de Vignes can give their own personal testimony as to how we rose up and we made use of the policies and programs of the People's National Movement over the years to where we are at this point in time. And personally, I want to say that I am grateful for the policies and the programs of the People's National Movement. It is what contributed to my education as a young man growing up in a rural community with a single parent in Paramin, Maraval. And I was able to educate myself and make use of the programs of the People's National Movement to where I am today, being qualified as an attorney at law, being elected as a member of parliament to represent the constituency of Arouca, Lopinot, and before Lopinot, Bonia West, being appointed chief whip in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as chairman of the People's National Movement. That is just my story. And so many of us have stories that we can share, personal testimony. And we can only attribute that to visionary leaders who give their life to contribute to national development. And when today persons are engaged in activities because of their own narrow political agenda to try to rewrite history, we consider that to be unfortunate. And we let our colleagues on the opposite side know that despite our political differences, these are matters that we ought not to litigate. Because when we do so, we create more disharmony in Trinidad and Tobago. And this ought not to be tolerated. It started by one Kirk Megu, and I saw in a recent missive issued by the Honourable Prime Minister, she's now attempting to double down on this unfortunate behavior by the PRO of the United National Congress. We are very proud of the work of Dr. Eric Williams. We are proud what he has done for the People's National Movement and to national development, as well as regional integration. The second issue I propose to raise at this news conference is a very sensitive matter, and one that I have to thread carefully as I seek to account to you, members of the media, and to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago on the work that we continue to do as the main opposition party in Trinidad and Tobago and in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. There are a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that, according to tradition, we will not put forward to the national community. But I will start by saying that one of the roles, or the main role and function of any opposition party in a functioning democracy, is to hold the government to account. It is our constitutional responsibility. Even if it is 13 of us, if it is 3 of us, if it is 20 of us, the main opposition party in a functioning democracy is to hold the government to account. Because the opposition at the end of the day is the alternative government, especially in Trinidad and Tobago. And how do we do that? The standing orders of the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago creates avenues for the opposition to hold the government to account. The standing orders provide for the filing of questions that must be answered on notice, questions that require written responses of the government, motions on the adjournment, motions for private members' day, and of course we have Prime Minister's question, where the opposition is given the opportunity to ask questions in the national interest. When the standing orders of the Parliament was amended, I believe was somewhere in around 2012, 2013, the Standing Orders Committee introduced a new standing order to allow for the opposition to ask questions of the Prime Minister once every month, Prime Minister's question time. It gives the opposition an opportunity to ask the Prime Minister questions relating to any aspect of governance in Trinidad and Tobago. Very simple. And since this standing order has been introduced in the standing orders of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, you members of the media would have recognized, and members of the public observing parliamentary proceedings would observe that the opposition, at least 1 hour, because as per the standing order, would file questions before the sitting of the Parliament, and the Prime Minister must come, and the Prime Minister must be prepared to answer those very important questions asked and filed by the opposition. What normally happens is that you provide for supplemental questions. And since this standing order has been introduced, all prime ministers in the past, in answering those questions, would subject themselves to supplementary questions that may flow based on the responses of the prime minister. I sat in the parliament since 2020, and I observed the former prime minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, dutifully attending parliament, especially on prime minister's question time, and answering all questions filed by the opposition, as well as all supplementary questions flowing from the responses that he would have provided. I witnessed it. So therefore, before and even before 2020, between the period 2015 and 2020, it has been the tradition of our Republican Parliament for questions to be filed, questions to be answered by the Prime Minister, and supplementary questions to follow. And those supplementary questions, as you know, will flow based on responses by the Prime Minister. So over the last 10 years or 15 years, it has been an established practice for questions to be posed to the Prime Minister and for supplementary questions to be asked of the Prime Minister so that he or she can answer on the floor of Parliament. Unfortunately, last week we observed that the opposition was unfortunately denied the opportunity to ask supplementary questions of the Prime Minister based on a ruling. We were taken by surprise because the answers provided by the Honourable Prime Minister warranted and demanded further scrutiny and examination by the elected opposition. And unfortunately, the opposition was denied the opportunity based on the Speaker's understanding, as he ruled, of the standing orders. There's another dimension to this particular issue. And oftentimes, these things are not known by members of the public. The opposition, in accordance with established practice, will submit questions to the Speaker, and the Speaker either approve or disapprove of the questions. And therefore, questions that you may see the opposition being allowed to ask in the Parliament may not necessarily be all of the questions submitted by the opposition. But I believe it is very important for the national population to have an understanding of what we continue to do in the discharge of our constitutional duties in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. I want to bring to the population's attention the list of some of the questions that the opposition submitted to be answered under Prime Minister's question and what was eventually approved. The Member of Parliament for Arouca, the Honourable Opposition Leader, asked the following question. With respect to the reported threats made against cabinet ministers, can the Prime Minister state what official reports, if any, have been lodged with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service? Not approved. Member of Parliament for Arouca, the Honourable Penny Beckles, Leader of the Opposition. Next question. Can the Prime Minister state how many footballers have been targeted for national team selection pending proclamation of the recently passed Constitutional Amendment Bill ahead of the October the 14th March versus Curaçao? Not allowed. Member of Parliament for Arouca. In light of the increased diplomatic tensions between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, which affect national security and regional stability, could the Prime Minister state what steps are being taken by the Prime Minister to de-escalate the situation? And you can perhaps check to see whether or not those questions were asked in the Parliament. The leader of the opposition again, does the government of Trinidad and Tobago recognize Nicolas Maduro as the president of Venezuela? A question from the Member of Parliament for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West. Would the Prime Minister advise how many persons have been detained via detention orders? Well, of course, this one was approved. The Member of Parliament for Arouca Lopinot, the Honourable Marvin Gonzales, asked the following question. In light of media reports that $1 million worth of narcotics have disappeared from the Barataria police station, can the Prime Minister state what security measures have been implemented to prevent the disappearance of the narcotics and other court evidence-related material in police stations across the country, and whether any investigation is being conducted into the said disappearance? And 3, whether any TTPS officers have been transferred from the Barataria police station? Not allowed. The Member of Parliament for Diego Martin Northeast, in light of the mysterious and unfortunate death of 8-year-old Jesha Francois at the San Fernando Teaching Hospital last month, and the instruction for an urgent investigation by the Prime Minister, can the Prime Minister confirm whether the said investigation has been completed and a report submitted to her on the matter? What was the conclusion of the report regarding the cause of death by Jasper Francois? And 3, what action her government has taken in light of the conclusion of the investigation to protect the integrity of the public health system in Trinidad and Tobago? The Member of Parliament for Diego Martin Central, Simon D. Nobrega, can the Prime Minister state what social safety initiatives, programs and measures have been specifically put in place to protect the welfare and support for the families of recently terminated CPEP, URP, and reforestation workers and their dependents? The Member of Parliament for St. Anne's East, Dr. Nayan Gasbidoli, could the Prime Minister indicate the number of persons that applied for book grants 2025, the number of eligible applicants, the total value of book grants distributed to date for the current academic year, the total number of students who receive grants, and the eligibility criteria used for the grants? The Member of Parliament for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, the Honourable Stuart Young, in light of the serious and definitive statement of the Minister in the Ministry of Housing, Philip Alexander, that India will deploy a nuclear attack on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, would the Prime Minister inform this House whether the government of Trinidad and Tobago has requested the Indian government to deploy a nuclear attack as indicated by her said government minister? Ladies and gentlemen, these were some of the questions posed to the Honourable Prime Minister on behalf of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago on serious matters of governance in Trinidad and Tobago. We believe that in order for any democracy to function and for any parliament to function effectively, the standing orders of the parliament must be interpreted in accordance with the practice and the established practice of this parliament. And as we have allowed supplemental questions to be asked of the Prime Minister in the past, and they have dutifully discharged those functions, as Opposition Chief Whip, I will work and I will give the commitment of the People's National Movement, the leader of the opposition, and the official opposition in Trinidad and Tobago, that I will do whatever I can to work with my colleagues opposite and all presiding officers to ensure that the standing orders of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago are used to promote and to advance democracy and to hold the elected government to account. And when the standing orders are interpreted or used in such a manner that can allow one to believe that the opposition is being undermined to discharge its functions, its constitutional functions, it does not augur well for democracy in Trinidad and Tobago. And it should concern all of us. All of us. And I want to give the assurance to all the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago that as an elected opposition, we will continue to do what we can within the confines of our constitution and the standing orders to hold the government to account on serious matters of national importance. The last issue I intend to briefly raise is the alleged visiting of known gang leaders by a sitting government minister that has occupied some media attention over the last couple of days. And a statement issued by the People's National Movement asking for the Prime Minister to launch an investigation into whether or not the Honourable Minister of Homeland Security received the appropriate authorization by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service as well as the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service for the Minister of Homeland Security, who before, in his capacity as a senior officer in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, to visit certain prisoners at the maximum security prison. Whether such visits were authorized at the highest level in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service as per the standing orders of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, that is, whether the Commissioner of Police authorized such visit when the Honourable Minister of Homeland Security was a serving member of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, and whether such visits continued after the minister was elected as a member of parliament for the constituency of Tunapuna, and when he served and continued to serve as the Minister of Homeland Security, whether such visits continued. And therefore, the opposition reiterates its call for a full and thorough investigation as to whether or not those visits were authorized by the Commissioner of Police as well as the Commissioner of Prisons, and whether those visits occurred before and after the Honourable Minister was elected as a Member of Parliament and appointed as a Minister in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll ask Senator Dr. Amery Browne to come and address you on some other critical matters.
Thank you very much, colleague, Chief Whip of the People's National Movement, Member of Parliament, the Honourable Marvin Gonzales. Also recognize the presence of my brother, the Honourable Hans de Vignes, Member of Parliament for Diego Martin Central. Good afternoon. Diego Martin West. Members of the media who have joined us today, welcome to this opposition media conference. I want to begin where MP Marvin Gonzales started as well, in recognizing the birthday of the late, great Dr. Eric Eustace Williams, first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and the founding father of our nation. Today being the 114th anniversary of his birth, it is incumbent upon us as patriotic citizens of this nation to pause for a moment in recognition of his sterling contributions to what many take for granted in Trinidad and Tobago today. It's even more important given the deliberate, concerted, and strategic attacks being leveraged against his contributions and his legacy, bizarrely occurring from the seat of government of Trinidad and Tobago. I recall When I first walked into Queen's Royal College as a young student, one of the names on the wall at the hall of QRC is Dr. Eric Williams. He was one of the early national scholarship winners of Queen's Royal College and in Trinidad and Tobago, and his name remains there to this day. And that was in part my own inspiration to work hard, to apply myself, etc. I was blessed eventually to have my own name up there, some distance from his. I'm a little younger than he was, also on that wall, and it is my hope that generations to come would be so inspired as well. All of that is set back, is not assisted when opinion leaders and senior politicians are engaged in this concerted attack against his legacy. I want to join MP Gonzales in condemning that conduct, calling upon the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the Prime Minister, the PRO of the UNC, and all others who may be so inclined to restrain themselves, to avoid the rewriting of history, and to allow the due inspiration to uplift the upcoming generations. It's something that we should avoid at all costs, the conduct that we're seeing. That leads me to some comments with respect to the Prime Minister's references to our bilateral relationships, particularly with Venezuela, and her comments about putting Trinidad and Tobago first. I think members of the media would acknowledge that that has now become a sort of standard point of rhetoric from the Prime Minister. When asked or challenged on any point, she would simply throw in a phrase, well, I believe in putting Trinidad and Tobago first. We've seen this tactic utilized other parts of the Western Hemisphere where it's really a case of sloganeering. But when you examine behind the slogan, there is insufficient substance, very little substance to back it up. So what exactly is she referring to? I'm putting Trinidad and Tobago first. First of all, the UNC is on record. In fact, she herself is on record as commending the putting of party before country. That came out of her lips to my recollection. Additionally, when you engage in concerted firings of individuals, especially those on the lowest rung of the socio-economic ladder, is that really putting Trinidad and Tobago first? When you engaged, and it still occurs, in concerted attacks against independent senators who are prescribed by the Constitution of the Republic, is that really putting Trinidad and Tobago first? When you attack the foundation of our very existence as an independent nation and as a republic, is that really putting Trinidad and Tobago first? When you, first of all, avoid supporting and denying your presence at independence and national events for years, consistently when in opposition, is that putting Trinidad and Tobago first? And then as Prime Minister, when you have the first opportunity in 2025 to cause to be convened the National Independence Celebration, you cancel those. Is that putting Trinidad and Tobago first? And I just want to remind the media and this country that it was this same Kamla Persad-Bissessar and her colleagues within the UNC who were part of a move to remove Republic Day as a public holiday in Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't want this season to pass without due reference to that. It fits into this whole context of what they are about while, well, first of all, while in opposition, and certainly while they're in the government. And most pointedly, the type of rhetoric that is being deployed by the Prime Minister and several of her ministers with respect to our standing within CARICOM or relations with other states within the Western Hemisphere, and in particular our relations with our closest and largest neighbor, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. When you look at the language being used and the posture of Trinidad and Tobago, is that really putting Trinidad and Tobago first? So those are the questions to assist in getting behind the slogan, because anyone can say anything. You can do anything and say, well, I'm putting Trinidad and Tobago first, but you have to examine for the substance behind it. I don't need to remind the media of some of the rhetoric that I'm referring to. Talk about blowing them to pieces, kill them all violently, reference to deceased persons as carcasses. That is unbecoming of any head of state, and certainly unbecoming of the Prime Minister of a CARICOM member state. There is no precedent within the Caribbean community whatsoever. We've raised this before, particularly the Prime Minister's response to the distinguished President of Colombia, when there was a request for assistance with the search and retrieval of bodies, human remains, whose identity has not yet been established, whose nationality has not yet been established. The response of the Prime Minister of this country was deplorable. References to carcasses, that's not how Trinidad and Tobago refers to any human remains, notwithstanding their activities or alleged activities. References to, we will not assist in the search for any remains. Again, I want to point the media and the population to international law, the Geneva Convention, which demands and anticipates a very different disposition from any government and member state of the United Nations. Article 17 of the Geneva Convention gives direct reference that belligerents, and maybe that's a good word if we're describing the rhetoric of the current government, belligerents shall ensure that the dead are properly interred. And Article 8 of the Additional Protocol 2 gives direct reference to this. All measures shall be taken without delay to decently dispose of the dead. How do you juxtapose that against those obligations, against that very belligerent response, public response of the Prime Minister to the President of Colombia, another large, very friendly neighboring state with whom we are required and expected to collaborate and cooperate to maintain the Caribbean as a zone of peace, to maintain and ensure the safety and security of our maritime space users, fishermen, commercial seagoers, seafarers, search and rescue, etc., etc., etc. So we want to emphasize that as a law-abiding member of the United Nations, it is anticipated when giving comments about foreign policy, our Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of this country, would give due reference to international law. Such references have been completely absent in her postures, her declarations, her WhatsApp messages, and the other means with which she has been interacting with the media. And I would ask you rhetorically, when last has the Prime Minister of this country presented herself at a media conference to respond to questions and concerns from the media? I'm not referring to while walking in and out of an event, because you can speak to anyone in that manner. That is not presenting yourself for examination of your positions. Trinidad and Tobago has found itself, due to the actions of the Prime Minister and his government, embroiled in a cycle of increasing tension and controversy and concern, which has affected persons all around this country and region, which has caused consternation within CARICOM and alarm even among our fishermen. And she has not, to this point, even given the opportunity to the national public and the media to examine her and her positions on this matter. We declare that this is completely unacceptable. So week after week, the opposition is presenting ourselves, giving our positions very clearly, spelling them out, responding to any question that you might offer, while the government is avoiding such examination, particularly when they're setting policy and determining positions. This cannot be allowed to continue. So I refer to this sloganeering by convenience. And then in the midst of these slogans, such as putting TNT first and its resemblance to catchphrases used elsewhere, the Prime Minister seems to have a problem with the phrase, a zone of peace. And we've seen a number of her references where she seems to wish to dilute those references, notwithstanding the fact that this is the established language of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and the established traditional language of the Caribbean community, of which we are founding members of Trinidad and Tobago. So on one hand, advancing a particular type of sloganeering, but for some reason, CARICOM's and CELAC's language seems to be striking some dissonance with the Prime Minister and with some of her ministers. We in the People's National Movement stand by the ideal and the call for the maintenance of the Caribbean Sea as a zone of peace, and in so doing, that unites us with our brothers and sisters right across the region and member states of CELAC. We are also calling for the Prime Minister to give an account of her stewardship and tenure as the lead CARICOM head on regional security. She's approaching 6 months now as Prime Minister of this republic in 2025, with such responsibility ascribed to the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. There has been no reference to her taking that responsibility seriously, no reference to her causing to be convened any security-related meeting on a regional level, no reference to her sharing evidence or information or statistics or details with CARICOM colleagues that would support some of the public posturing that she has been very aggressive with. I can say without fear of contradiction, there have been questions from CARICOM and CELAC delegations as to upon what evidence has Trinidad and Tobago been declaring their support for certain military actions that have occurred in the Caribbean Sea recently. We are not aware of any substantive response from the Prime Minister or the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So she must give an account for her tenure as lead head on regional security within the CARICOM quasi-cabinet. And then the Prime Minister arrives later today in New York for the high-level week of the United Nations General Assembly. And I can say that we're very pleased that the Prime Minister has, for the first time, taken up such a responsibility in 2025. We express or grave concern that for the CARICOM Heads of Government meeting and the CARICOM Africa Summit, the Prime Minister chose not to attend. And tomorrow, the Prime Minister is due to deliver a national statement on behalf of the people of this nation. It is the hope of the People's National Movement and this opposition that the Prime Minister will give due reflection and reference in this national statement, not to any narrow political rhetoric or justification for illegitimate actions, but to the ideals, the standards, the vision of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. There should be due reference to international law in such a statement. There should be due reference to the International Criminal Court, of which Trinidad and Tobago is a founding contributor, thanks to the former late great A.N.R. Robinson. We have been consistent in our national statements, including the one made in 2024, in outlining clear Trinidad and Tobago solidarity and support for the ICC, which, as you in the media know, is under attack today in the form of sanctions and other pressures being brought to bear on the prosecutor and members of the court. Trinidad and Tobago is called upon and required to give a clear position on these matters. The last 6 months, no such position has been outlined by the UNC government. I extend that same caption on the issue of Gaza. So we took note that the Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs yesterday, due to some questioning, did give a reference to the issue of Palestine, finally, and said that the Trinidad and Tobago continues to support the state of Palestine and the two-state solution. Well, that isn't really the controversy, because it was the People's National Movement administration that took the decision to recognize the state of Palestine, one, and to establish diplomatic relations with the state of Palestine, two. I would remind the media that back in 2011, several CARICOM states were presented with a proposal to recognize the state of Palestine. The same Kamala Persad-Bissessar was Prime Minister at that time. Her then Minister of Foreign Affairs brought that proposal to the cabinet, and it was rejected. It was rejected. We approved, we established diplomatic relations. What is at stake now is a clear, definitive statement, ideally tomorrow, to the global community, of Trinidad and Tobago's position on the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, and for Trinidad and Tobago to join with the international community, who have with clear voice condemned the genocide and called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, along with, as we have said, the release of all hostages. That is what is required now, not vague references to a two-state solution. We've already established a firm Trinidad and Tobago position on that issue. Needless to say, this genocide continues on a daily basis, is completely unacceptable, and the voice of Trinidad and Tobago in these matters should not be silent or tepid. It should be loud and clear. That is what is expected of us. And finally, I want to give reference to a few other issues that we would anticipate in any sound national statement. clear commitment on climate change. It may not be as fashionable in the Western Hemisphere these days, but principles are only of value when in times of inconvenience. So these are principles, and we should stand by them, notwithstanding a prevailing political, hemispheric, or global shifts. Climate change, as a small island developing state, is an existential issue for Trinidad and Tobago. And then the plight of the vulnerable. We talk about the vulnerable within a state, but there's vulnerability in the global community as well. So besides Gaza, the issue of Haiti, the plight of immigrants and how many are being treated within the Western Hemisphere, the issue of reparations, all of these form important pillars of any substantive Trinidad and Tobago national statement. MP Gonzales referred to our distinguished leader of the opposition attending key meetings in New York at this time as well. I want to make it very clear, Mrs. Penelope Beckles Robinson did not invite herself or storm. I saw some very sad references to storming something or storming any event. These were definitive and formal invitations extended to her, given her stature in Trinidad and Tobago, and given her long and distinguished service, including her service as a senior diplomat of this country, representing our nation at the highest level at the United Nations. So one of those fora is the Building Shared Infrastructure, Climate, and Health Resilience Through Innovation. This is one of the very important side events at the UNGA. And Health Innovation Exchange, which actually takes place today. The distinguished leader of the opposition will be contributing, not just sitting in the audience, contributing on the Health Innovation Exchange and the other forum that I referenced a few moments ago. So all of this to sound a note of concern and warning with respect to Trinidad and Tobago's stance. Our global and regional image is being negatively affected by the posture, the rhetoric of the current Prime Minister, and certainly certain ill-informed members of the government. As we always have, the People's National Movement and this current opposition will be here to respond to you and also to lay out our clear priorities and principles for Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions later in the program. Should I? And I now properly introduce the Member of Parliament for Diego Martin West, the Honourable Hans de Wet.
Thank you very much, Senator. Up to the Honourable Amery Browne, Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate. I also acknowledge Chief Whip and MP for Arouca, Lopinot, Marvin, Gonzales. Members of the media, we want to thank you again for joining us today. As always, in changes in life, we acknowledge where we've come from, and I will always see you all as my colleagues. On this 114th anniversary of the birth of the late, great Dr. Eric Eustace Williams, our first Prime Minister, as a person, much like most of you who has benefited from education policy, let us be reminded of his brilliance and what is possible when we decide to serve. Today, I come to you to address issues relating to sport with a look at the not so distant past, the present, and as one of the younger members of Parliament, a heavy focus on the future. Now, let's look at PNM, the People's National Movement's support for athletes over the years. Over the years, the PNM has always invested in its athletes. We are proud, we are patriotic, and we understand the importance of sport and what it does for us as a people. When you look at some of the sporting venues like the community pools, which I would have trained in as a teenager, the velodromes, the aquatic center, the National Racquet Center, the Browne Cricket Academy, all built creating opportunities for athletes to train and compete at the highest level. When we look back at 2006, under the leadership of former Prime Minister Patrick Manning, the PNM introduced the Elite Athletes Assistance Program. This initiative was designed to support athletes financially as they prepared for and competed in international tournaments. This program speaks to athletes who are world ranked in individual sports. Those athletes who medal at Olympic Games, World Championships, Commonwealth Games, Senior Pan American Games, and Senior Central American and Caribbean Games. Funding was allocated and continues to be allocated under the following categories. Athletes ranked in the world top 10 positions will qualify for the maximum sum allocation of $250,000. Athletes ranked in the world top 11 to 40 positions will benefit for up to $187,500, 75% of the maximum sum. And back then, athletes who medal in the specific games and championships would have benefited on a case-by-case basis from up to $75,000. The funding was provided for athletes who undergo a 4-year cycle of preparation and training leading up to an Olympic year. Now, when we look back at August 14th, 2024, an article by Ian Prescott in the Express where the Honourable Shamfa Kojo Lewis at the point in time had to defend the position, and I quote in that article, she said, "The government has continuously supported athletes throughout the years via the Elite Athlete Assistance Program, which allows athletes such as I, Walcott, and Jareem, the Dream Richards, to continue their training leading up to major international events." At this point, it's necessary for us to take note and remember that the day we plant the tree is not the day we shall eat the fruit. Building on this, in 2018, the National Rewards and Incentives Framework was introduced to reward athletes who achieved medals at the highest levels of international sport. By 2022, this policy was expanded to include the World Athletics Indoor Championships. To this end, a gold medal winner at the World Athletics Championship is entitled to a reward of $500,000. Silver medal winner entitled to $250,000 and bronze $150,000 TT. Today, like everyone else in Trinidad and Tobago, we celebrate the achievements of athletes such as Keyshawn Walcott and Jareem, the Dream Richards, at the World Athletics Championships. Yes, we commend the current government for continuing a PNM-led policy that was first championed by the former Minister of Sport and Community Development, Mrs. Shamfa Kojo Lewis, and the hardworking staff at the ministry must also be acknowledged. The amounts announced to be given to these athletes, these are not gifts, but earned rewards based on policy for their hard work. We must also look at the struggles while we look at the celebrations and the greatness. Recently, as a country, we celebrated and recognized some of our top performers in sport. Their success brought immense pride to our nation, and rightfully so. But as we applaud some achievements, there was one group glaringly absent from the recognition given by this UNC-led administration: our powerlifting athletes. These athletes proudly carry our flag at World Championships, Pan American tournaments, and Commonwealth events. Yet, when they return home with gold and silver medals, they are often met with silence, especially in this instance. Despite medaling at international and regional competitions, we are told that powerlifters often receive little to no support beyond minor expenses such as meals and gym fees. Officials argue that recognition and funding are skewed towards athletics, football, and swimming, while other sports are sidelined. For instance, in June 2025, at age 27, Zara Padia, the first female athlete to represent Trinidad and Tobago at the International Powerlifting World Championships, placed 8th in the world and brought home 4 gold medals at the Pan American Championships while breaking 5 records. She is the 8th strongest woman in the world in her weight class, yet the UNC has refused to acknowledge her achievements. Just last month, at the Pan American North American Championships, the national team secured a total of 56 medals, including 20 gold, 25 silver, and 11 bronze. These incredible achievements deserve to be acknowledged. We are calling on the government to look to the future, to extend the Elite Athletes Assistance Program to the Powerlifting Federation, and to recognize athletes like Zara Padia. Rishon Superville as well. At the Junior World Championships in Costa Rica, he placed 5th overall in the world and brought home a silver medal for his stellar performance. And Joseph McDonald, at just 22 years old, Joseph has made history for Trinidad and Tobago on the world stage. On September 5th, he represented our nation at the International Powerlifting Junior World Championships, where he secured first place in the 120 kilogram weight class. Joseph also set a new record in the bench press, lifting an incredible 568 pounds or 257.5 kilograms. With this achievement, he's now officially ranked the #1 junior athlete in the world for the 120 kilogram category. Now, these athletes continue to achieve against all odds. We must always remember, when these athletes succeed, they do so for Trinidad and Tobago. We must treat them with dignity and give them the support they deserve. I also call on the government to work with the Trinidad and Tobago Hockey Board to resolve the current embargo placed on them due to the fiasco that happened a couple of months ago, where they were unable to attend Pan Am, and also work with them in resolving the fines to the Pan Am Hockey Federation. It's not about pointing fingers, it's about governance, it is about taking responsibility, and it's about working with those in charge of different sporting disciplines. This is also an important time to note the upcoming World Para-Athletics Championships in New Delhi that begin this weekend, where our delegation includes Akeem Stewart, who has held the world titles in the F43 shot put, javelin, and discus. Also, as we look to the future, given the recent removal of sponsorship from various cultural groups of the National Gas Company, it also raises the question of whether or not the sponsorship of the entries and other athletic related activities will continue. And if the sponsorship will be discontinued, we ask the government to please explain to the population the reasoning behind this. This is a call to action and the future. Yesterday, I read an article in Newsday where the Minister of Sport reaffirmed his support for Trinidad and Tobago athletes. This is a call for him to do just that, and the government. We are calling at the government at this time to expand the Elite Athlete Program to help these and other sporting disciplines that have represented us internationally. In recapping, we must acknowledge the work of the past, highlight the present struggles, celebrate our current achievements, and look forward to a brighter future for sport in Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you. We'll open for questions at this point in time. Thank you.
Who you would like to have first for questioning? It was about 14 questions, Mary. 14 questions. 4. Just want to also on that point that last week in Parliament, when Prime Minister's question time came up, the Prime Minister was not in the Parliament on time
Right.
to take the questions from the opposition. And the opposition did not raise any objections for that item to be taken up later in the proceedings when the Prime Minister found herself in the chamber. We took no objections to it whatsoever. I'm saying it to let you know that the opposition has been doing everything that it can to ensure that we have that level of responsibility in the Parliament and respect for our colleagues. The Prime Minister, when she came in, I was asked by the leader of government business whether or not we will agree to the Prime Minister making a statement, and the opposition agreed. We raised no objection to it. You also recall, if you observed the Parliament proceedings last Friday, the government asked for the Minister of Finance to present the bill until the conclusion, and the opposition did not raise any objection to it. The opposition rather asked the government and the Speaker whether the opposition will be allowed the same amount of time to respond. So we did not raise any objection, and the government did not agree to the opposition having the same amount of time to respond to the Minister of Finance. In my humble opinion, we have to be very careful in the way in which we conduct ourselves in the Parliament so that democracy can function the way that we expect democracy to function. Because there's a famous slogan in the Washington Post: democracy dies in darkness.
So, because when that issue you mentioned, the Speaker said no, that's what I saw. So is it that he had
Said no to what?
when you asked for equal time, sorry.
Yes.
I didn't see any movement from the government. I saw the Speaker said no.
He said no because he took the cue from the government,
Okay.
who showed their objection
Okay.
to the opposition getting equal time to respond to the Minister of Finance.
So what has happened with this idea that the Speaker has for the Standing Orders Committee to be convened quickly to address this issue? Has there been any movement in that direction?
Not as yet, but the opposition, as opposition chief whip, I will explore all of the opportunities to meet with the clerk of the House as well as my colleague in the government, the leader of government business, as well as the Speaker, to resolve this particular issue. And if it can be resolved without any amendment to the standing orders, of course, we will hope. All we're asking for is the traditions of the Parliament to be maintained, where over the last 15 years, we have allowed prime ministers and we've asked prime ministers to answer questions and to entertain supplementary questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I am hoping that the prime minister, the current prime minister, does have the capacity to respond to supplementary questions.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not about not showing up when it is time to answer questions and showing up late because you need to get the information. And even when you sit in the chamber, you still have to wait for information to come to you. And when the information finally comes to you, you're not prepared to answer supplementary questions. As a country, we have to be very careful, because I somehow suspect that the Prime Minister is unable to answer questions on her legs.
Right, because I mean, I remember in the past, just that there were times even when the Speaker would not allow, like she would say, the question doesn't follow, but the Dr. Rowley would still sort of want to look like if he want to answer the
Well,
question.
the Speaker does have the authority to determine whether a supplementary question is in line with the responses provided by the Minister or the Prime Minister in this case. So the Speaker, as presiding officer of these proceedings, authorizes or doesn't authorize questions based on what those questions are. But the point is that supplementary questions have been
Right.
part of the feature of our parliament
Right.
since it has been introduced in the standing orders of
Right.
the House of Representatives.
Right. I also noticed that there was a difference of opinion between yourself and the speaker, where the speaker was saying, look at the original question that you ask. He
Yes.
did it, that the supplemental question must be linked to the original question
don't agree.
only
And
and not the
And
answer.
And the standing orders, they're very clear on this particular issue, that the supplementary questions ought not necessarily to be on the original question posed, but based on the answer provided by the minister.
Right.
So for one to argue that the supplementary question must be based on the original question posed is not within the contemplation of the standing orders. The supplementary questions are based on the answers provided, and the opposition, being based on the answer provided, can pose supplementary questions on that issue and not necessarily hinge it to the original question posed. And that is the nature of our standing orders, so that the people, the citizens, can understand, because this is not a UNC PNM thing. It is about holding the government to account on critical issues of governance.
Right. Because a previous speaker, Wade Mark, allowed supplementary questions
Of
on
course.
Prime Minister question time. So
Yes.
is there room for some sort of how should I put it? Some sort of meeting of minds involving the two presiding officers, given the fact that there was one before
Absolutely, yes.
who allowed, this thing to.
I am hoping. I think we are all mature people. I don't believe that this, even though yes, it is the cut and thrust of politics, I would want to believe that all of us as office holders, we are committed to our traditions, our democratic traditions and principles, and that we operate in a way to allow our parliament to function in the way that it was intended to function. Rules, it is not possible for rules to apply for all scenarios and all situations. We have to use our discretion. And sometimes in the interpretation of rules, one must have resort to the traditions.
Yeah. And finally, on this issue, what is the role of the CPA in something like this? Does it have a
I
role
don't
in?
see any role for the CPA, but we have, as you alluded to a short while ago, the Standing Orders Committee. And if we have observed any lacuna in the standing orders that cannot otherwise be resolved, then perhaps we may have to resort to the Standing Orders Committee. But you also have to be mindful here that the government holds the majority,
Right.
and the Standing Orders Committee and the government may have its way.
But that's
in the
why
Standing Orders
that's
Committee.
why I asked about the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, where standards, I imagine, are consistent,
Yes.
and where what applies in other jurisdictions can be brought to bear on, an issue like
we will
this.
pursue all avenues and measures that will be available to us to resolve this issue. But the opposition, our position is that the Prime Minister's question on the agenda of the Parliament must be preserved in such a way that the citizens can understand critical issues that the people are very interested in and want to hear directly from the Prime Minister her stance on these matters when they are posed legitimately by the opposition.
Just one more thing. Are you saying you're not satisfied with the explanation given by Minister Alexander's lawyers on this issue of the meeting with alleged?
Sorry about that, but I haven't seen the position of Minister Alexander's attorneys on this particular matter.
Yeah,
I am saying that the PNM has asked for a full and thorough investigation as to whether or not those visits that occurred whilst he was a serving police officer were authorized by the then Commissioner of Police and the Commissioner of Prisons, and whether or not there were other visits after he was elected as a member of Parliament and appointed to the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago.
The position has been published in the I know in the Guardian and the Express, where his lawyers, Anna and Ram Logan, Freedom Chambers.
What we saw was internal documents in the TTPS between alleged internal documents by senior officers within the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service on this particular issue. But we have not seen any document that can stand the test of scrutiny, whereby the Commissioner of Police, who is the only authority that has the power to authorize such visits, communicating with the Commissioner of Prisons on this matter. And that's all we are asking. So a correspondence moving from a senior superintendent to assistant commissioner or a deputy commissioner of police cannot be the authorization that you're asking for. At the end of the day, it is the commissioner of police that has the authority corresponding with the commissioner of prisons in order to allow for this to happen.
So you want the Commissioner of Police to clear the air on this?
The Commissioner of Police has to tell the country whether there's any written authorization from the office holder at that point in time allowing for such visits to take place, and whether or not such visit, whether he, the current office holder, also authorized those visits.
Yeah, but okay. So, but the Commissioner of Police now was not the Commissioner of Police at the time that
So
those...
whoever was sitting in the office of Commissioner of Police, whether or not they authorized those visits before and after the elections.
Okay, I just want to... So what are you asking for the Commissioner of Police to say what the previous, what his predecessor authorized?
Correct.
Okay, all right.
Good evening, Joey Bartlett with Newsday. If you could clarify, you said earlier, answering her question, that you believe the Prime Minister doesn't have the capacity to answer the questions. What exactly do you mean by that?
I did not say that. I'm just saying whether or not the Prime Minister has the capacity, because she entered Parliament late on that day. When that item came up on the agenda, she was not in the Parliament. And when she eventually arrived in the Parliament, it was about 45 minutes after. It came back on the agenda and we did not raise any objections whatsoever. So I am just asking the question whether or not the Prime Minister is unable to answer supplemental questions that have been placed and posed to her on her feet.
So she has the what, intellectual capacity?
The stamina, what capacity?
I would leave it like that. I prefer to leave it like that. No problem. The population can come to its own conclusion.
With respect to Dr. Amery Browne earlier, you said that her slogan, "Put TNT first," is similar to others we have heard. Do you mind saying where you would have heard a similar slogan?
Well, I haven't heard put TNT first in any other jurisdiction, but the point is empty sloganeering requires some further examination. And so what I sought to do was to look behind the reference to putting TNT first, comparing with the actions being taken by the Prime Minister, particularly around our national identity, our heritage, our history, and to question whether that the association of that slogan can stand the light of day. I can give you an example of another type of sloganeering that would have led to some problems, because I referred to it at the last media conference, where, and now there are charges at the International Criminal Court brought against the former president of the Philippines, former President Rodrigo Duterte. He deployed a number of very belligerent slogans and public posturing in his so-called war on drugs. So he had a very aggressive war on drugs, which appeared to be quite inconsistent with the laws of the Philippines, it is alleged, and international law. His slogan was an eye for an eye to make our streets safer. A slogan. But behind that slogan, actions were being taken, particularly the extrajudicial elimination of small-time drug runners. Might sound familiar to keen observers within our region. The extrajudicial elimination of small-time drug runners without trial, resulting this week in charges being brought against a former head of state of a sovereign country, charged with crimes against humanity under his war on drugs, including reference by the ICC to this. He was an indirect co-perpetrator. He was an indirect co-perpetrator. So I'm just saying, slogans and extrajudicial actions and positions can result in very serious consequences. And hopefully a word to the wise would be sufficient. And just in that case, you would be aware the drug trade is still alive in that part of the world after all of his public posturing and excitement, because a lot of it is simply based on demand. Yeah?
Dr. Browne, Vivian Bones from Express. Two questions for you, one after. The first one, the so-called diplomatic tensions between Trinidad and Venezuela. The so-called diplomatic tensions. I just want to know what might be some of the short-term and long-term consequences Trinidad could foresee or could happen off of that.
Yeah, so you've phrased the question in a very sensitive manner, but they're not really so-called. These are tensions. And even with respect to the very negative cycle that's still underway between this government and a neighboring government, with public utterances that really have resulted in significant tension between two neighboring states, that is worthy of further examination. The consequences are serious and negative. With respect to the ability, I've referenced it, for coordination between the Guardia Nacional of Venezuela and the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, which I can say without fear of contradiction, has occurred over the years as a matter of routine, notwithstanding changes in administration. Now, with this negative cycle, our ability to properly coordinate and partner on technical matters and sectoral matters would obviously be affected. Our potential for energy collaboration in the near term or even medium term would clearly be affected as well. And this is very serious for Trinidad and Tobago and our future, because these, I made the point before, these resources existed. This oil and gas existed long before you and I were on this planet, and long before Prime Minister Prasad Bisesa, President Trump, all the other players on the global stage. And they will exist after we leave the stage, unless or until a functional relationship is distilled to the extent that those resources can be modernized and put to use to develop our respective peoples. So there's a responsibility, and we've always conducted ourselves in a prudent way, so keeping an eye on our interests. And for us, that really is putting the country first, as opposed to getting carried away with rhetoric scripted elsewhere and losing sight of what is important to this country, to our fishermen, to the respective persons on both sides of the border, to our trade and other interests, to our energy interests, etc., etc. So it's quite serious.
Would the deportation also fall into that category also?
Well, I've seen some references very recently in the media as well, including in the Express, which suggests that the usual pattern of cooperation with respect to deportations, which have occurred over the last few years under a People's National Movement regime. But what we did it responsibly and prudently, without fanfare and rhetoric. We engaged directly with our counterparts in Caracas. We utilized our respective missions, the Venezuelan mission here, our mission in Caracas, and we got both those who were volunteering to be repatriated to their homeland and those who had been deemed to have violated the laws of Trinidad and Tobago were deported, both particularly utilizing seaborne assets. A ship was utilized, as well as airborne deportations. Those occurred, but again, without great pomp and ceremony, but it was effective. What we're seeing now, possibly as a consequence of some very reckless and irresponsible public posturing and rhetoric, even that routine appears to have been affected. And who's the winner in that scenario?
Second question from Mr. Gonzales. Just for my clarification, he had stated that the Speaker of the House vet the questions before it goes to the Prime Minister. You had said that, right?
Yeah, that's the process.
Right. So I want to know, is there any requirement for the Speaker to give the opposition that, okay, these questions will not be approved?
That's not how it is. About 5 or 10 minutes before the sitting, we get an email telling us the questions that we approved.
And one final question to Hans. I could already see the comments, so you could just clarify it from one time. The extension of the elite sports program, elite athletes program. Thanks. The question that poses: why didn't the opposition who was in government previously?
Yeah.
Why didn't they extend the program?
So we have to remember that governance is continuous and improvement is also continuous. While the PNM was in government, we saw a lot of improvements in terms of athlete funding, and we also saw the rewards policy. We saw expansions, we saw improvements. What we're calling for is a continued improvement on what has already been built. The foundation is there. We're just asking the government to do better by the athletes and continue on the foundation that has already been set.
Dr. Browne, Doris Polo, Guardian Media. Earlier you mentioned that the Prime Minister should avoid narrow political rhetoric when she makes a contribution to the UNGA. You wanted her to make a definitive statement on TNT's position on Palestine and on Haiti. I want to ask your thoughts on the potential diplomatic pitfalls or missteps for a small state like TNT when the Prime Minister officially takes that position and makes the country's stance known at the UNGA?
Well, we have the shelter of principle. And we've always had that. It's available to us. Now, if we choose to disassociate ourselves from principle, that's when we get in trouble. When you associate with principle and or establish foreign policy, that's a safe zone for a small state, particularly in the calls that we have made and that we wish Trinidad and Tobago to continue to associate with. These are calls that have been made by CARICOM, by CELAC, by the OACPS, and other regional, sub-regional, and international organizations of which Trinidad and Tobago is a part. So it's not an expedition on our own. It is Trinidad and Tobago continuing to associate with principled foreign policy positions. And maybe the current government needs to be reintroduced to the issue of principle on the global stage. So, I saw one thing that we should note is the question around who would the Prime Minister be meeting in terms of a counterpart on the US side. There were a few references from Minister Sean Sobers about a meeting to be held, but precious few details have been disclosed. That's a little bit unusual. What we do know is that President Trump has left New York. He's no longer physically available for a face-to-face meeting. What we also know is that 5, almost 6 months into a new Trinidad and Tobago administration, there has been no meeting thus far with the Secretary of State or any senior official from Washington, D.C. I saw reported a phone call, a telephone call between our Prime Minister and a Deputy Secretary of State, which occurred a few weeks ago. A Deputy Secretary of State. It is our hope as Trinidad and Tobago patriots that this meeting with the United States of America that the government has referred to will see significant and senior and appropriate representation on both sides of the table. But we certainly will be monitoring very closely on that. And all of that to say and to remind you that Trinidad and Tobago is on the cusp of a very important candidature for the United Nations Security Council by way of a non-permanent seat. And member states of the UN will be looking at us very closely, and they have been listening to us. What we associate with, what our principles are, what our policies are, what is our foreign policy, to make their own determinations as to whether Trinidad and Tobago can represent a voice of progress and have sovereign positions at that very important seat, the highest seat in the global order, at the United Nations Security Council. So again, our national statement is relevant to that, and our rhetoric or foreign policy and positions is also relevant to that issue. And there are key issues to be determined at the Security Council and at the United Nations, including a very strong voice for reform of the Security Council. Trinidad and Tobago has associated itself with that call previously. The question is, what is the current position of this country and the government in that regard? There is a strong call, and the question goes to the Prime Minister and the government. Now is a great time for it. Strong call for Africa, the African continent, the African Union, to be represented permanently on the United Nations Security Council. The call was made right on the floor of the General Assembly, most stridently by the distinguished President of Kenya. Trinidad and Tobago must have a position and a voice in collaboration, always, with the Caribbean community.
Jules Browne, TV6 News. So we have heard from the government its very stated support of U.S. military action on what the U.S. has said are narco-terrorists, persons involved in illegal drug trade from Venezuela. This is what the U.S. has been saying. What is the opposition's declared position on this matter of the U.S. using the military to deal with what they say are narco-terrorists in the region?
Well, I would remind you, our principled position, first of all, is on matters of regional security. Trinidad and Tobago cannot recuse itself from an approach for CARICOM consensus and a CARICOM position, particularly given our responsibility as lead head of regional security. So that was the first misstep. Secondly, as a law-abiding, principled member state of the United Nations, it is incumbent upon us to request and receive sufficient evidence and information before associating ourselves with any military action. the public it has not yet been shared with the public whether Trinidad and Tobago has received any such detail. I can say without fear of contradiction that many of our CARICOM brothers and sisters, fellow member states of CARICOM, have not received any such detail. And you would have noted a lack of such public positions coming from other CARICOM member states. Even the oft-referenced Guyana continues to refer to the Caribbean Sea remaining as a zone of peace and the need for collaboration, coordination, and concerted efforts against the drug trade, etc. A much more responsible and prudent position. So we're not advocating for a pro or against or anti any one stance. We're advocating for what we've always had, a principled stance consistent with international law and the foreign policy of Trinidad and Tobago.
Do you think the situation requires direct talks between the President of Venezuela and the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, due to the reckless, irresponsible, and imprudent positions and exchanges that have been occurring via megaphone, social media, WhatsApp, etc., the Prime Minister would be expected to take action to reduce the tensions. So we have to acknowledge that there's tension. These blustery references to we have good relations. No one is being persuaded by that because it is clear in the public domain what has been transpiring on both sides of the border. So again, as a responsible member of the regional community, Trinidad and Tobago should take steps to reduce tension. Usually, we would have associated with us, as Guyana did in their challenges, a strong CARICOM solidarity for our scenario or positions or recommendations or interests. We, from the first moment of this crisis, the Prime Minister ensured by her own words that would not be available. Again, reckless and irresponsible.
We saw the Prime Minister distancing her administration from the statements of one of her ministers about India nuking Venezuela and so on, and she said that told her minister to stay in his lane and whatnot. But clearly, the government, at least the vice president of Venezuela, took those statements very seriously. Are we in a situation where persons representing Trinidad and Tobago at the highest levels have to be extremely mindful of comments, whether it's on social media or otherwise, because Venezuela certainly, or the rest of the world, is watching and may take those things at face value?
We live in an age of social media. We live in an age where one comment made today can have unforeseen and potentially very serious or even devastating consequences. One of the things I was taught very early on by a former prime minister by the name of Patrick Augustus Mervyn Manning is when you are a government minister, every word that comes out of your mouth is government policy. When you're a government minister, every word that proceedeth from you can be considered government policy. So it behooves, if you are responsible, mature, educated, prudent, wise, properly brought up, responsive to a cabinet, etc., it behooves you to conduct yourself accordingly. But that part is the Prime Minister's headache, how she keeps reckless members.
I do have just two questions for Mr. Vignes, if you don't mind. So when I had posed a question to the Prime Minister at the Diplomatic Center about the preparations for the budget, we heard about sports tourism, and I believe a pending decision with regard to the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Sport and so on. We were hearing a lot of focus about tourism, but the issue of sports tourism, do you think that is something, if there's, let's say, to put one if it's tourism to go in sports ministry or that kind of thing, would that be in any way a better way to deal with the issue of sports in Trinidad and Tobago and tourism?
Yeah. So with reference to sport, tourism, we all know sport can benefit our tourism product in a serious way. We saw it in terms of the many games that were bought here by Shamfa Kojolos when she was Minister of Sport and Community Development. Now, that would be led by government policy. The government has not articulated their policy on sport to the country, and we await to see that. And then from that position, we can then make criticisms and seriously understand. Whilst we may have our own personal thoughts, the government would have their policy, and we would like to hear it.
Is there a distinction between, and of course we all acknowledge the work, the performance of the Trinbago Knight Riders at the CPL, but we also acknowledge the efforts and the achievements of the two athletes who represented Trinidad and Tobago on a national level, internationally. Is there a distinction between a franchise team with, of course, in one way representing Trinidad, but on a franchise level, and those actually representing the nation internationally in terms of the decision for national awards?
Yeah. So franchise cricket and franchise sport is franchise sport. But we have to remember, although it is franchise sport, it is a representation of the area, the particular district that is represented by the sport, and the pride that comes from that particular team winning will always benefit the country. We are proud of the Trinbago Knight Riders as a team that represents our jurisdiction, although it's not all nationally born athletes. There is a distinction that should always be made, but the pride that comes from their victories is something that we can all resonate with.
I do have one question for the Chief Whip. We are still waiting, the nation that is, on the exact date of the budget, as far as I know. But in terms of what you've heard so far, the Prime Minister had mentioned in terms of focus on job creation, innovation in terms of dealing with, I guess, recurrent expenditure and so on. And that she said that it should be, if I recall correctly, a very good budget. But given the opposition's concerns with regard to the issues at CPEP, URP, etc., what is your sense of how the government can deal with issues that, say, for example, job creation, given what has happened at CPEP and URP?
The government has not announced any major policy that one can interpret to mean that it is going to cause employment generation in Trinidad and Tobago. Since the government has come into power, the government has engaged in mass firings across the state sector, the dismantling of programs that were designed to assist the most vulnerable in our national community. Needless to say, CPEP, URP, reforestation, and what have you. We've also seen that the government has attacked executive management at CAL, Caribbean Airlines, TSTT, WASA, just to name a few. And then the Prime Minister saying that the government intends to remove contract employment in the public service. The Prime Minister has not announced whether or not how government conducted a job evaluation exercise in the public service, and how removal of contract employment, which of course comprises thousands of people in the public service, and how you're going to remove that, and what kind of impact it is going to have on the delivery of public services in Trinidad and Tobago. So what the government has been saying so far, really, the reality is that thousands of our people and our citizens continue to lose their jobs. The latest calculation is about 40,000 or more. And when you add contract employment to that in the public service, you're talking about maybe 6,000 or 7,000 people might be impacted. And then you have the Prime Minister employing wives, her cabinet, employing the spouses of cabinet ministers to state boards and what have you. So the government has not announced any major policy initiative in Trinidad and Tobago that one can say will create employment in this country. And therefore, what the Prime Minister is saying about it going to be a good budget and what have you, creation of employment and what have you, just empty platitudes. The government is just devoid of any ideas. It seems as though they are shocked that they are in government in Trinidad and Tobago. It is make it up as you go along. Voops, vai. That is what this government has been doing. And I am not looking forward to any major announcement by the government in the budget that will give hope to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. What they will do to distract the population is to come with all kinds of bombshell revelations and allegations of corruption. And this budget is all about dropping mark and dropping bombshell to distract the population from the fact that the government has no clear agenda to manage Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Piggyback on something Joan had asked. Are you satisfied with the reprimand that the Prime Minister gave to the person who made the allegations on social media, who made the claims on social media that India will drop a bomb? Are you satisfied with that reprimand?
What I can say is that any right-thinking citizen would be pleased that the Prime Minister, though a little late, took steps to disassociate himself and an official Trinidad and Tobago position from those very reckless and irresponsible utterances, which, as you know, were made with a United National Congress backdrop and banner, etc., etc. It was very important, but just one passing comment should not be sufficient. What is required is a shift in language to a more prudent, responsible, properly thought out. You know, normally you would apply some brain power to these matters as opposed to what we've been seeing. So it occurred a bit late. The matter was allowed to percolate too long. It generated responses, counter responses. They were doubling down on our side. Very, very unfortunate. And again, I don't want to prolong, but these things have consequences, and it is going to take a lot of work today by our diplomats and others engaged overseas. We have staff in Caracas right now, and their job, their practice, their craft is made much more difficult when you have government officials misconducting themselves publicly with consequences for a nation and our region. So that disassociation and clarity on what is Trinidad and Tobago's government position is important.
Okay. And we saw also, Dr. Browne,
last question, if we may.
Oh, go ahead.
I've just asked two little questions.
A supplemental maybe.
Yes,
Go on.
yes. One is, Selwyn Kojo had been associated with the PNM in the past, and there has been this constant, what could I call it, rapport between himself and elements of the PNM. Do you agree with he's the one who said it, that people were saying that he didn't deserve the award that he got, and it was only afforded to him because of his affiliation to the UNC. So do you agree with that position, or do you think that he was deserving of it? And two, what do you think of the choice of Julie John to act for the Prime Minister?
Two very interesting questions. What I can say, there would always be a temptation to get into political and trite repartee. As a responsible opposition, we would always be grounded in process and procedure. Government of the day has the mandate and the onus to make those recommendations. There's a National Awards Committee. The recommendations go to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has a a key and essential role, and the president arranges and does the bestowal. So once these awards are conducted in accordance with those processes, we don't wish to get into, as an opposition, picking and choosing, but just to say that we, as patriots, would find ways to always be represented at national level events, even if and when we do not agree with all of the details. And yesterday, at those national awards, the People's National Movement was represented and present, quite unlike the posture and position of the UNC. Myself was there, and other members of the team, parliamentarians, were present, quite unlike the posture of the UNC when they are in opposition. So that response covers some of the supplemental elements. We always look at the procedure, and once it's in keeping with that, we don't want to pick and choose.
This whole debate about who was the first prime minister and all of that, he's
Well, I don't know if he got involved in that on the wrong side of it.
Well,
I suspect silence says a lot with respect to his position on who the first prime minister of the Republic of Trinidad.
and Julian Jonathan.
The same applies. The onus is on the prime minister, and our expectations, whether it's prime minister, acting prime minister, with respect to prudence, responsibility, public posture in a way that is in keeping with the standards of Trinidad and Tobago, we would only wish the best.
Just to, as we end the news conference, thank you very much for attending. Just to let you know, as well as the national population of the PNM is going to be hosting its second national consultation on Stand Your Ground bill that is being proposed by the government. It will be held in Shogunas at 5 p.m. and we're inviting 5 p.m. today, correct, at 5 p.m. today. It has been advertised widely on social media and other places. So we just want to take the opportunity at this news conference to inform and to remind the population that we are going to be having our second consultation, national consultation on Stand Your Ground at 5 p.m. in Shogunas. And if you cannot be there in person, you can join us live on our social media platform and to be part of this very important national conversation. Thank you very much.